And we are, as a people, inherently and historically
Wake up.
opposed to secret societies, the secret oaths, and the secret proceedings.
The show that asks questions about why we don't ask questions.
What the hell is going on?
This is Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Welcome to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. These are the conspiracy queries that Alan Park is right about to ask almost immediately. We have an activist on our show. He's an author, a writer of many books, some of which are quite troublesome to the powers that be, like the Black Book of the Canadian Foreign Policy. Things you don't really hear about. And when you go to the Wikipedia page, it's kind of redded out. There's no link to that. Yves Engler is here with us today, and we're going to get busy with him right now. It's a full show, so buckle up. What do you make, Yves Engler, with what's going on right now and the way we are sliding Canada? We're just gone into this ISIS war, whatever that is. What's your take on the lay of the land right now?
Well, I think things are pretty grim from the sort of bombastic kind of militaristic type thinking policy to on the ecological level, complete indifference to where the state of the planetary system's going. So yeah, no, I think there's no doubt that certainly the Harper government has worsened what are long-standing tendencies of Canada's role in the world, being one of advancing the interests of big corporations and military companies and the U.S.-led empire. So
you find Harper to be a willing puppet to a greater... because I can't believe a Harper is a puppet of an Obama when they seem to be politically somewhat distant, not entirely, but basically he's just happy to do whatever is told to him. Is that right, Harper?
No, I don't think it's a question of... I think Harper's clearly a full-on... you look at his stuff on his complete and total support for Israeli expansionism, for Israeli war crimes in Gaza and elsewhere, and it's not a matter of. I think he's a believer. I think Harper, fully believes in Western-led domination of the Middle East, and he's into, to a certain extent at least, at one level, the sort of clash of civilizations kind of outlook. There's major corporate forces in this country that fully back that. It's not a matter of just doing it for Washington's sake. I mean, I think that's in the background, and Canada has long been, at least since the Second World War, has been fully integrated into the U.S. empire, and not necessarily in a subservient role, but in fact that the Canadian elite are well integrated into U.S. capitalism, into U.S. military companies, and on and on and on. And so I think Harper represents that. You also have the tar sands, the rise of the tar sands. And that obviously leads to being completely hostile to any attempt to reduce carbon emissions. Then you also have this incredible rise of Canadian mining investment across the globe, throughout the global south. From between 1989 and 2011, Canadian mining investment in Africa went from about $250 million to about $31 billion. Similar kind of numbers, actually even more incredible numbers in Latin America, where just an incredible rise in mining investments. So I think that leads to a lot of concern among Canadian business that those countries, be it in Africa, be it in Latin America, maintain extreme free market capitalist policies to allow foreign companies to take those natural resources out of the ground at with very little paid in terms of royalties or taxes or the like. So I think there's a lot of elements to explaining the aggressiveness of Harper's foreign policy, but I think that when you look at some of the questions of mining sector, tar sand sector, military companies, alongside with this sort of idea of Western/European imperialism in the Middle East, I think that explains a lot of
unquestionable imperialism, don't you find? I mean, the paradigm itself is not to be touched. It's like, oh, okay, we're in there doing this, so that's okay. If anybody else has problems with this, take a number.
For sure, I mean, it's you look at this stuff on like ISIS, and it's just accepted that it's for us to decide to intervene, and it's we are of the higher order that gets to decide that Gaddafi is no longer acceptable in Libya, and we're going to intervene on bomb the place and intervene on behalf of one faction, one political faction, and we're going to wrap ourselves in human rights rhetoric, and when all the signs suggest that the human rights situation has gotten infinitely worse, or has gotten worse, significantly worse, then we will just ignore the human rights situation in Libya.
Sorry, which human rights situation was that? The one in Libya? What are you talking about?
Exactly.
Oh.
So it's like Canada had nothing to do with the fact that there's two different governments in Libya now, that there's a terrible sort of civil war, sort of regional war playing out, and the vast majority of those who follow the corporate newspapers or the CBC, they'll have no sense of the fact that the Canadian government played quite a extensive role in creating many of the problems that are going on in that country today.
Well, I did think of it. I'm sure many have when Harper came into power, saying, you won't recognize this country when I'm done with it. A lot of people at the time thought that was a bad omen. His supporters thought, well, he's going to try to improve the place, and now he's really ruined things. It's so bad now, I can't believe it. You hear that, world? We're not sewing Canadian flags on our backpacks anymore. Neither are the Americans. Let's go back a little bit. You brought up a lot of great points. Let's start with the military now. How is it that this particular jets contract over the last several years that was $9 billion, and then $12 billion, and then the latest estimate was 16, and then 21 billion up to 40, and etc. Now we're at 65 billion, and they're going to pull the plug on this. There was huge opposition to it at the time, yet it went through anyway, and now it looks like they have to hit the reset button, as they say. When can we hit the reset button on this government? Like, how can we make people understand some of the things they're doing? And you brought a lot of great points up in the first few minutes of the call, but I've read about these things, and it just seems like most people aren't paying attention to most of those things enough to do anything about it. I saw a poll today. This Harper is apparently in some poll, if it's to be trusted, above the others still. I mean, I don't know. Not that I favor the others, but I'm just saying I don't know how, with his horrible track record and his, bludgeoning us and the world with his policies, how it could be even close right now.
Well, I think, one element is an always important element in this, understanding people's willingness to vote or to support politicians is to understand how the media plays a role in actually disinforming people in terms of what's actually going on. And on the foreign policy front, it's kind of amazing to see some of that. So just take one recent example. So we just passed the 5-year anniversary of the earthquake in Haiti, where upwards of a couple 100,000 people may have died. Terrible destruction. Almost probably the overwhelming, vast majority of Canadians, go back 5 years, what they were concerned about was, holy, these pictures on TV of all of Port-au-Prince being leveled, being destroyed. We have to do what we can to help people who are, lost limbs, who are still trapped under buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So, sort of an outpouring of human compassion for victims of a natural disaster, but in fact it's not simply a natural disaster. It's more complicated than that with in terms of understanding some of the history of the politics of Haiti. But basically this outpouring of human compassion. Well, what was the Canadian government's response? What was the Harper government's response to this terrible disaster? Well, they sent 2,000 Canadian troops to Haiti. They didn't send the heavy urban search and rescue teams that exist in cities all across the country, which is express purpose is to help in times of disaster, to get people out of trapped out of under buildings, to get basic medical care to people. Instead, they sent 2,000 Canadian troops alongside about 15,000 U.S. troops, alongside some more UN forces who've been occupying the country for about 10 years. We have received, the Canadian press did access information and found the internal documents of the Canadian government on deciding to send troops after the earthquake and not send the heavy urban search and rescue teams. And it was because they were concerned that there was a political vacuum in the aftermath of the earthquake, and that the former president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, that we helped overthrow in 2004, right, that his government, or that he, who was then in exile, he might use this political vacuum to try to return, and that more generally, that the long-suffering Haitian population might use this political vacuum to sort of assert themselves. And Ottawa, with Washington, were concerned, and hence they sent troops after an earthquake instead of search and rescue teams. And this is public. This is access to, because it's Canadian press. I'm just quoting from a Canadian press article that got the internal documents. Yet on the 5-year anniversary of the earthquake, try to find one Canadian media that mentioned this. Try to find one Canadian media. I watched the CBC, and they've gone on and on about how all the great stuff Canada did in Haiti after the earthquake. Oh, how these people have, yet the stories of the thinking that was going on in Ottawa after the earthquake are basically entirely ignored. Yeah. That's just one small
one example. Okay, we're speaking with Yves Engler. He's an activist and an author, and he knows a lot of things about Harper that you're not going to find out about in the National Post or other Canadian publications. Folks, Harper around the world is our leader for a little while anyway, until we can knock him off. We'll be back with Yves Engler. These are the kinds of things that people don't seem to stitch together, though, Yves. Like you said, that was a mainstream report, and people really seem to demand this, because anything coming from outside the mainstream, like my show and lots of other means of information, your books, for example, well, it's outside the mainstream, and people don't want to believe that kind of thing. But every year, these things stack up, and people like you, thank you for doing this, putting these facts together. Now, this is the thing that I always had. It's like a fantasy for me. It's like, if enough people could understand some of the connections that A plus B equals put tab A into slot B, then we'd get out of this trouble. But people just don't seem to be paying attention. Or they're the other folks that are actually profiting from it and would love to stop you in your tracks.
Well, that's the second part. I think that is also, we can't be, it's not just a question of people not understanding. There are people who are obviously very consciously supporting these kind of policies. So, concretely,
sure,
there are lots of Canadians, primarily those who have stocks in oil companies, but even some who are do engineering work, who drive a truck or whatever, that were making money off of the tar sands. Right? There are people who when it comes to Canadian mining companies exploiting abroad and causing conflicts in pretty much at this point, pretty much every country in the global south, you can find an example of a Canadian mining company that's in conflict with a local community. There are, obviously there's the stockholders who are making money from it, but there are also, engineers and office workers and whatever here in Canada that have, getting some trickle down from that process. Are they benefiting as much as if the whole process of corporations going around the world, they're at the same time that they may be benefiting in one sense from working for a Canadian mining company. On the other hand, they're being hurt by a global economic system based upon corporations having rights to just trample on communities. So there's a benefit on one hand and a negative on the other hand for many of the people working for these companies. But there are people who are benefiting. So that's part of the story. But I think that the media is a central component to this, and also the whole political system, the opposition, the intellectual class on the foreign policy front, especially, are put up almost no opposition. Right? If you look at the NDP's position, the supposed social democratic opposition party's position on Harper's support for Israel's bombardment of Gaza in the summer, the NDP basically went along with Israel's killing of 2,200 Palestinians in Gaza, a quarter of which were children, and destroying a quarter of all homes, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, let's take it back before we'll spend some time there later, but let's take it back to the tar sands. And what do you make of things now that we've had this economic stewardship, which is the main thing that our conservative figurehead has always touted himself as being, an economic steward. And we find ourselves in a world where, much against his liking and desires, the barrel of oil has lost, less than $50 now, and that's not good for him and his tar sands. And now people there are leaving their jobs, or they don't have any anymore, as the tar sands that we had to focus on for the economic engine while we were damaging the planet are now not so viable, apparently. His own people, the own people that he was trying to help in the first place, maybe aren't so in love with him anymore. So what I mean to say is, how do we put a rap sheet together? Not that people don't understand what he's doing, but how do we put a rap sheet together and go, sure, you're going to vote for this guy? What about these 19 things, most of them damaging your world and taking money out of your pocket? There must be a way to put a focus on this.
There is, and I think that that's where political activism comes into it, and that's where organization comes into it, and it's a matter of work, really. I mean, it's a matter of going out there and putting up posters, handing out leaflets, right. Organizing rallies. It's not going to be done for us. It's not just going to be because powerful interests are basically happy with the government. So it's going to be done by popular grassroots activism, and I think there are groups that are pursuing strategies, very targeted. I'm not talking about just the opposition parties. They have their own interests and their own calculations, and those are, for the most part.
You're right, though. They seem very similar. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's similar in the Trudeau platform. Doesn't seem to be much variance at all, except for the color of their tie.
Yeah, Trudeau's a bit better looking.
He's a bit younger.
He's a better looking guy than Stephen, so it makes it all okay that that he wants to support killing children in Gaza or supporting whatever the Keystone Pipeline or whatever it is that Trudeau's in favor of, that Harper is, which is a big chunk of it.
Well, let me just come at you from left field and ask you a question I hadn't planned to. But what do you think about the fluoridation of water in urban drinking water supplies?
To be honest, I'm not particularly knowledgeable on that issue. Okay. I know it's a contentious one. Yeah. I don't have I wouldn't call myself sufficiently informed on the issue to
okay.
have.
Well, I'm not going to hold you over the coals like a scientist or anything, but just to say though, sufficient to know, your answer is sufficient enough to know that there was a clip of Justin a year or two ago, I guess, and he was starting to come up as a thing, and someone asked him the same question. He said, where would you be on the stance fluoridation of water. And you've just admitted you don't really know that much about it. But he kind of admitted the same thing. But in a way that he did it, it was really off-putting and contentious, because it is a contentious issue, as you say, and I thought that's a huge mistake. He said, oh, yeah, I've heard the conspiracy theories on how that's not great. I'm not interested in talking about that. And then he just moved on past the guy. And I thought, but what do you know about the ingestion of sodium fluoride into your body, Justin? Seriously. So he won't even sit down for a couple of seconds on a legitimate question, and the way he duffed that off. So it makes me think that on even more complicated and even more serious issues, he might be equally, useless.
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt that Justin Trudeau is not planning on doing much different than what Stephen Harper's done, except looking a little bit better, and on a few issues, softening the roughest edges of the Harper policy. But I mean, is Obama that much different than George Bush? Yeah, he's a little bit less of a warmonger, and he's a little bit less, around some of the edges is, a little bit more willing to regulate the banking industry a little bit more. But mostly it's the broad. It's something more systemic than a matter of just the individual in that position.
So where do we find the system? Who is the system? What is the system? Why do these people think, hey, I'll do this for my country, and I'll change this and make things better, and then they get into the system, and of course that doesn't happen. Who's really running the agenda as far as you see it?
I think it's overwhelmingly, it's not. This is. I don't believe it's being done in small groups per se, but it's done by those who own the most stocks generally, those who have the most control over the economy. Obviously, someone like the Thompson family, the richest family in Canada, which owns a significant chunk of the media. They obviously have a whole lot of influence over the policy realm. Here in Quebec, you have the Pelado, one of the billionaire that owns huge chunk of the media, alongside another billionaire Desmarais, who owns, and you can go to the Maritimes and then look in. Probably the most stark is the Irvings. So it's. I mean, it doesn't come down to one family that runs things, but have in alliance with other major corporate interests and other very wealthy people, and they tend to fund the think tanks. They tend to fund university departments. Famously, the Munk Center, the preeminent foreign policy think tank in Canada, is funded by Peter Munk, who's was the head of Barrick Gold, the biggest gold company in the world, who's a raving right-winger supporter of Pinochet in Chile, extreme pro-Israel, total anti-Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
So he likes to give back, is what you're saying.
Exactly, he likes to give back. He likes to have his name on your university departments and hospitals. And
exactly. Oh, yeah, sure. For this guy's rapacious ways, he came up with enough money that you can sit here and wait for your unnecessary chemotherapy drug. That kind of thing. Yeah. That's pretty nuts. Now, are you aware, like we were talking about tar sands and kicking that one a little bit. I want to ask you, are you aware at all of the ELA closure, the Experimental Lakes Area closure?
No.
The ELA is a body of lakes. It's in northwestern Ontario, like up around Kenora, top of the Lake Superior and everything, and around there. And it's just inside the Manitoba border. It's been there for years and years. They use it. It's a scientific base, and they use it to monitor some of the most pristine water quality, as you can imagine, in the world up there in that place. And there's a lot of scientific factors about where it is, regarding aquifer, and a lot of scientific terms that I don't really understand. But there's reasons scientifically and geologically why this is an amazingly a treasure trove of information regarding the safety and health of drinking water around the world. And tons of cities, countries from around the world, and representatives and scientists have been. This is a great thing for them to go to the ELA and get some more information, and it costs several $1 million a year to operate or whatever. And a couple of years ago, they pulled out the funding from this.
Oh, Oh, yeah, okay.
They decided, well, we don't need that anymore. I was like, what? And the rest of the world was saying, well, hang on, that's a great... What do you mean you're not going to pay for that? Well, we have fiscal responsibility and all of this, and we can't afford to keep this thing. Well, it turns out that it's, when you look at it, it's not really all that far, let's say, downwind or downstream from the southeasterly flow of the sludge that's coming out of the tar sands. And, of course, it's going to show up in there in the ELA, and then it's going to be friggin' alarming, and it'll be absolutely inarguable that stuff going on there is the end of the fucking world. So they just defunded it, and that's it. And we just don't get to hear about it. It's like Homer Simpson putting the black tape over the the engine light on his car instead of putting oil in it. You're supposed to. And that's what they did with this experimental lakes area, because it's just downwind from those ponds. And I'm just trying to get more people to know about it, because it's insane.
This was part of the whole in the omnibus budget, where they threw in gutted a whole bunch of environmental
probably
policies.
A couple of years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, no one read it. In other words, yeah, exactly. You were talking also about mining, and mining is a very contentious issue. Mostly people are thinking now about oil and should we drill for oil, and should we have pipelines or not, and railways. But mining is something that is going on all the time, and I don't think a lot of people think about the ramifications of this. But it's very something that you have found is that Canadian companies around the world have a really bad track record for this. How do they get away with that kind of thing?
Well, they get away with it by, Canada's the global powerhouse in mining. Something like almost up to 75% of the world's mining companies are listed on Canadian stock exchanges, which is incredible. And it's based upon, partly the history of mining extraction in this country, but in large part because the restrictions are so loose in terms of what needs to be disclosed on the stock exchanges themselves, and the fact that the Canadian government has lags behind the U.S. and Europe with regards to corruption policies to deter Canadian companies from engaging in corruption abroad, and because the Canadian government provides so much support for the mining sector globally through Canadian aid, through diplomatic support, through Canadian embassies around the world, helping these mining companies out, and they're in conflict. They're in conflict with communities that don't want arsenic in their drinking water, and they're in conflict with communities that don't want whole towns that are, in some cases, whole towns that get leveled to support to bring about an open pit mine, in conflict with communities that are doing artisanal mining, small scale mining, that the livelihoods of people get crushed by the mining companies, and then they're also in conflict at the level of cheap, not paying proper taxes, and all kinds of examples, like in Tanzania, where they all kinds of different games that Barrick Gold has played to basically avoid paying almost any taxes to the Tanzanian state. So it's a industry. It's been discussed, and the Harper government has refused to bring in legislation that would put Canadian diplomatic and financial support to mining companies abroad that have been found to be engage in abuses, that they would restrict support for companies that were found to be causing abuses abroad. So there's basically carte blanche, or the companies can do whatever they want abroad, and there's no repercussion. They get full support from the Canadian state.
Can you just say that again? Carte blanche.
Carte blanche.
Okay. That's nice.
Carte blanche.
Yeah, you do that better. You're from Quebec, and I just say it like a dumb white guy from Canada, carte blanche. But I just wanted you to hear that again. Right. Well, that is a huge mess. So the thing I don't understand about this is, and there's a lot of things I don't understand clearly, but how is it that, something that is the land of a nation, a mountainside or a river or whatever, and a foreign company comes in and just takes this and mines it, literally, takes whatever's valuable at it, at any kind of damage to that land, and then just takes that money and takes the profit from this and leaves the mess with that. I don't understand. Is that not like How is a guy in jail for taking somebody's wallet if this goes on all the time?
Yeah, you go all the way back to 1962. The United Nations the General Assembly passed a resolution on I think it was titled the Permanent Sovereignty for People's Natural Resources, something like that. It basically said that natural resources, minerals, and whatever country should be used for the benefit of the people that live there. It's a pretty straightforward idea. I think it's an idea that many people around the world, probably I would venture to guess most people in the world, would agree with.
Well, that's the value of the country. Like, how much copper do you have? How much, whatever. Yeah, exactly. So how do they just take it?
But they, if you actually, I'm doing a book about Canada's role in Africa right now, and when you look at the structural adjustment programs that the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank have pushed on African countries over the past 25 years, with the Canadian government right there, fully supporting the process, and they, in many instances, more than 30 different countries have under World Bank direction, African countries have rewritten their mining codes as part of this process, and they invariably rewrite their mining codes in a way that's better suited. What were previously nationally run mines, state-owned mines, have been privatized. Royalty rates have been slashed. Companies' ability to not have to purchase anything locally, or not have to refine any of the raw resource locally, have been eliminated. Also labor regulations to make it easier to fire when the price of copper goes up. You can hire a bunch of people. When the price of copper goes down, you can just fire all the workforce. All that has been done in a very elaborate, extensive way by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, with the support of certainly the Canadian government has been right there. Obviously, the U.S. and British government have been supporting this process, and it's been very lucrative for the Toronto Stock Exchange and those who are the big stockholders on the Toronto Stock Exchange and the Vancouver Stock Exchange. It's been less of a good thing from the standpoint of communities' ecology, and from the standpoint of many people from Mexico to the Congo. But it is an important part of Canada's
history,
corporate contribution to the world.
Yeah, our contribution. SNC Lavalin, apparently we're the most corrupt nation on the planet as far as international business dealings are going. It just sounds like, the way you describe it, it's just like they're just a bunch of crazy pirates running around, just causing trouble, kicking down at doors, abusing people's rights, taking away their value, giving them a hard time, leaving them the mess to clean up when they're gone. And then, people are over here just kind of doing their jobs and everything, thinking, business is, it's a nice company opening up, and that's nice. But they don't think about that. This is like piracy, what you're describing, Yves.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when we look back on this era, that will be that will be how the history books are largely written.
At least you know when you're looking at a pirate, he's a pirate. These guys are pretending to be something else, and it just, I don't know how they get away with it. It's the color of the tie. Which one are you wearing, the blue one or the red one today? Oh, I think I'll change my mind. I don't like this team anymore. I'm going to go sit with the orange guys now. It's getting a bit much. Listen, we're talking to the fantastic researcher, activist, Quebec resident, and he says carte blanche like nobody else. Yves Engler. Yves, let me ask you something about, we've been talking about the pirates and the rapaciousness of what's happening in the Western corporatism, dumping in the aquifers and putting up, let's say, wind farms and any kind of appropriations and all these horrible things that happen to us here in the Western world. And now we're also taking a look at what's happening in the Eastern world with this ISIS, which I would also venture is also much of a Western problem or creation. But I'll leave that to you to talk about it. I'd like to get your take on ISIS. And most recently, I'd like to get your take on a piece of news I just heard. I had to double check and make sure it wasn't a satirical The Onion piece or something. That is that right? Saudi Arabia is going to build a 600-mile wall between itself and Iraq. Is this always the way we fix problems, by building walls? It worked so many times before, didn't it?
Yes, it's been a good model. I mean, I think that the Saudi Arabia, the ISIS thing, that's one of the weakest points from the Harper government standpoint of their foreign policy is that, weakest because of all kinds of problems with how things are, partly how things are in terms of the media realm. But Harper government has really deepened Canada's ties with Saudi Arabia. Biggest arms deal Canada's ever made was with Saudi, sending light armored vehicles.
No, wait a minute, hang on. I got to stop you here. This can't be true. How do you know this?
Yeah, I mean, it was reported on briefly in when it happened back. The government even announced it. Put out a press release back.
Well, that's strange because I've read also that Saudi Arabia has had a massive series of beheadings lately in there, according to their own government. And I thought what I read recently was that the Canadian government was not okay with beheadings. So sorry, I have to check you and your sources or anybody to make such a claim.
Yeah, they clearly don't have that big a problem with beheadings in certain contexts. They're willing to even arm it, and it's not. It goes worse. I mean, the huge arms sales. I mean, totally dubious in my opinion. But at least you could make an argument. Business is whatever. You can make that argument. I don't agree with it, but you can make it. But goes even worse than that. They sent out when previous Saudi princes have died, princes that were known for like tons of horrible, criminality. They put out press releases lauding a couple of instances. I can't even remember the name. I wrote about it a couple of years ago. About these Saudi princes, where they just put over the top press releases about how great a people these princes were and the like. So it's not, it's a huge amount of business stuff. There's a diplomatic element, and the question of ISIS, and the question of sort of jihadist violence, if you want to call it that. Globally, the main source of this completely, I don't know if you want to call it, backwards kind of or fervent type of viewpoint that is Wahhabism.
I'll take both. I'll take backwards and fervent.
Yes, fervent. Saudi Arabia is the preeminent. This is the funding. I just finished reading a book about Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the most of it it's a domestic issue and it's opposition to a U.S. Ethiopia invasion of Al-Shabaab. But the higher echelons, these are people who got grants from Saudi Arabia to go study in Saudi universities when they were very young, and so Saudi Arabia is the hub of the ideological movement or worldview, and it also happens to be the U.S.'s and in recent years Canada's preeminent Arab ally, like the U.S. relationship, Saudi Arabia goes back 70, 80 years with that famous visit with Roosevelt and
sure the new
on the boat there. But so this is I think an important, whenever we're discussing this question, we have to look at how has the West, specifically the U.S. obviously, but Canada, like I said, extensively under the Harper government, how have we emboldened and strengthened a major ideological pillar of this jihadist violence, and so that's one component I think of the ISIS question. But interesting enough, ISIS, part of the reason why ISIS I think is gotten the attention it's gotten is because it's actually becoming more of a threat challenge to the Saudis, and that's obviously a threat to Washington's structuring of the Middle East, and so it becomes a concern in part because it's just becoming a bit of a threat to our allies in the region. So when they were fighting against Assad, those forces, we were providing them with the weapons. The Saudis were providing with some of them weapons, but when they start taking out a bit broader of a vision about setting up a whole state structure across that part of the world, then they become a bit more of a threat.
Gee, if only we had an opportunity to learn a lesson like this in history, if something like this could have been so obvious, like maybe if Russia had sort of taken over Afghanistan and we decided to arm the rebels there to try to fight Russia or something, then we would have learned what a ridiculous, asinine, anti-human mistake that would have been, So maybe it's just that we didn't have enough opportunity to draw from.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I think it's that is the point. There is obviously a very clear, historical example of.
I mean, these guys are throwing bowling balls down alleys and hoping the pins don't fall over. I mean, it's so stupid. Sure, once in a while you get a gutter ball, but I mean, it's stupid. So, or is it? Or do we know that that's going to happen?
That's the question. I'm not sure. It's not just always stupidity.
No,
I don't think in this instance, this is the downside. The reality is that the Canadian government, the U.S. government, don't care that much if a few Canadians, a few Americans get killed in something, a terrorist attack here. That's not their primary concern. Their primary concern is the profits of major corporations, the military sales, the control of the globe, the control of the Middle East. That's their primary concern. And until these forces, unless they start really threatening those elements, that's only when they start becoming concerned about ISIS or the Bin Ladens or the whatever. So the blowback that comes from this kind of stuff is of, I'm not saying they're completely dismissive, but it's not their primary concern. Their primary, very concretely in the case of Harper and Saudi Arabia, their primary concern is a $15 billion light armored vehicle sale, which gives a bunch of profits to General Dynamics, which almost invariably, I don't know if this for sure, but I almost guarantee you, also you find some General Dynamics donations that go to the Conservative Party, some friends of the Conservative Party sitting on the board of General Dynamics. That's what their primary concern is.
You're saying General Dynamics, the company?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, because break that down for me again. General Dynamics is a supplier of what?
They produce the light armored vehicles in London, Ontario. That the $15 billion sale they made to the Saudis, financed by the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which is a crown corporation, and you actually even have Canadian military people who are involved in training the Saudis on using the vehicles, and these are obviously the same vehicles that the Saudis used in 2011 when they entered Bahrain to crush the pro-democracy movement in Bahrain and to prop up the 217-year monarchy there in Bahrain. But yes, General Dynamics, the Canadian subsidiary of General Dynamics, is the seller of these vehicles. Produced in London, Ontario, to
and we're looking at what, like $10 or $15 billion worth of money here. What are we?
I think the 14.7 billion is the official.
Okay. Well, I did pretty well.
It's more money that we could either think about being able to spend. So it's a major sum.
Well, I think about spending that kind of money, and I what are you talking about? Don't pay me into a corner. I was thinking that maybe we could do some things like if. I just thought it would be interesting to take, let's just say, the amount of money that was originally additionally summoned up from Congress by George Bush, say, 11 or 12 years ago for the Iraq War. And then it turned into a lot of money. And I just wonder, what are we at here? $17 trillion. Just say if you take let's just get everything the States owes, $17 trillion. Let's just take one of those trillions of dollars and spend that one. You're right. I can't think about all this money. But what if we, actually built the infrastructure that's crumbling out there? And what if we actually paid nurses and these kind of people the money that they really deserve and that kind of thing? That would be a little bit of a different scenario. But these guys that just want to spend all this money on war, like that's what I'm talking about, paradigm shift. Maybe it's not how much money do we give a military contractor to send hardware somewhere. It's like, how better can we spend this money to turn the results around that we really want to get?
The question is, do they really want to get them? If the amount of money that's been spent on the war machine was directed towards building proper sewage systems in across the globe, or improving education systems. You
pop a couple million down and you get rid of the sewage and you bring in some drinking water in some areas that have been going crazy for 4 decades without that. How are they going to get mad at you? And I'm sure it's a much more economical investment overall.
Yeah, well, it could be. The problem is that it doesn't necessarily. I mean, they try to, but it doesn't always benefit major corporations, right? You look at one of the things that's so brilliant about military spending is because it's heavy, certainly in terms of procurement. Heavy chunk of this money is going to some very big corporations that are very powerful firms, and it turns into profits for stockholders, and particularly the biggest stockholders, pretty quickly. So I think that's part of why. I mean, there's people talk about how lots of right-wing politicians are willing to do what's called military Keynesianism, right? They're against Keynesianism. They're against putting government money into stimulating the economy, except when it comes to the military. And I think that there's partly an ideological component to that, partly that they try to frame themselves as patriots and all that kind of sort of nationalistic stuff. But a big part of it is because there's some major corporations that are the actual beneficiaries of that type of economic stimulation. It becomes a bit more complicated when it comes to some of the paying teachers. Who's gonna pay teachers? Teachers are going to get the money. It's not necessarily going to be siphoned off in profits for the big stockholders.
Absolutely. Just before we go, I want to make sure that we spend some time speaking about your book. You have one that was just out recently. You've got 7 books, and you're working on an 8th. So let's hear about the one that's currently the newest one that's out there, and the one you're working on a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's foreign policy, which is basically a critical overview of Harper's foreign policy that goes from his policy in Libya, bombing Libya, to ardent support for Israeli expansionism, to the mining sector, and many other places. And the book I'm working on now is called Canada in Africa: 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation, and it's a probably sort of half historical look of Canada's support for British colonialism. Go all the way back to during the slave trade, but and then about half sort of current day stuff, and looks at all kinds of different elements in Canadian corporations that are involved in privatizing chunks of the African economy, private security companies. One of the interesting things I've come across is Montreal-based Garda World, one of the biggest private security company in the world, not listed publicly on a public stock exchange. It's 45,000 global employees. Garda World they're the biggest security provider in Libya, and involved in all kinds of very questionable operations in Libya. I don't have a whole lot of detail. Obviously, it's difficult to get the details on some of this stuff, but they provide security for the UK embassy, and there's been some of their arms shipments that have been stolen at the Tripoli airport and the like. So this is a company, 3,500 employees in Libya. They're probably one of the prime beneficiaries of NATO's destruction of Libya, and they were actually almost certainly in contravention of the UN Security Council resolutions. They were in Libya helping the rebels out before Gaddafi, at least 6 weeks before Gaddafi was actually killed, which was the actual UN Security Council resolution explicitly said no mercenaries. So that's one component.
It said no mercenaries. What?
The UN Security Resolution, it was supposed to be an arms embargo, right, of Libya, and that was ostensibly what Canada was doing, and sending naval vessels off the coast of Libya and stuff. That was to stop arms from coming in for both sides, because it was ideas to move towards a non-violent and so the resolution actually specifically mentions mercenaries, and yet on Garda World's website, they themselves say clearly that they were in Libya in the summer of 2011. Gaddafi wasn't killed until October 20th, which is obviously past the summer. So they're explicitly saying that they were on the ground, and other reports say they were helping the rebels out. So that's just one small example of Canadian militarization of Africa.
Like a private security company.
Yeah, the biggest privately owned private security company in the world. Kind of like Canada's Blackwater.
I was going to say, is this like an Eric Prince operation, the Blackwater kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean they hire. They have former SAS, the British, the former head of special operations for the U.S. military, who was supposedly one of the people who planned the assassination of Bin Laden. He's on their board of directors, and so yeah, this is Canada's Blackwater. Back in 2007, a couple of their employees in Iraq were kidnapped, and I'm not sure if they were killed or not. But so there's been a bit of attention to the company. But no attention to their operations in Libya, where, like I said, the biggest private security company in Libya, and no, they're also involved in Somalia now and Nigeria. So it's a small sign, but obviously the Canadian mining sector. I cover it extensively in the book about the Canadian mining companies and conflicts and killing people from Tanzania to Ghana and Congo to Mali. There's conflicts with Canadian-owned mines all across the continent. So it's been very interesting researching the book. I thought having done 5 books about Canada's role around the world, I thought
so you knew it all.
I thought I knew.
You just come out and say it, Yves. It's okay. You thought you knew everything. But you found more stuff. Yeah, it gets darker and deeper the more you push, huh?
It is. That's no doubt. That is the feeling after going through it. But at the flip side of this stuff is that I said this too. In terms of on global issues, I think on foreign policy issues, people are more interested. If you go back historically, and there's Canadians who fought to conquer all kinds of different parts of the continent with the British, right? They were integrated from the Canadian militia. Sometimes they were trained at the Royal Military College and then went off to head up officers in British military, and in some cases there was Canadians who were governors. There's a Canadian who was a governor of Ghana, Canadian who was a governor of Kenya, northern Nigeria. But back 100 years ago, this was done almost without any contention. I'm not saying that now there's a lot of contestation or enough contestation of what's taking place, but there's at least some contestation, and certainly significantly more contestation. So on the foreign policy front, while we're very far from shaping policy, the popular forces or the humanistic forces or the internationalist forces, whatever you want to call those who are challenging Canadian foreign policy, we're much greater today than we were 100 years ago. It's a small bit of solace and ultimately a grim picture, but it's important because I think that is the, if we're going to change things, that's what's necessary, is more and more people to be engaged and knowledgeable, right, and challenge and dissent.
Well, this is why I say, like, I swear that if some people knew some of the things that are just beyond the headline of the commuter tabloid newspaper and did a little work or were able to access work of people like yourself a little bit more easily, there's the rap sheet. Like, you might think, maybe your aunt living there in sort of the mid-section of the country, and she's, maybe an older woman, and she likes to make cookies and bread, and she thinks that Stephen Harper's doing a wonderful job because he's a very decent-looking man with a tidy head of hair that's not all over the place, and he wears a tie, And he's a wonderful man, and he's a Christian too, and she also goes to church, so she resonates with him. And yeah, am I making fun of people that are ignorant of the overall policies? Yeah, I am. And there's guys like that as well. I really am. But they think he's a wonderful man. And I just have to say, if those people, if you could just give them like a hockey card, or a baseball card with stats on the back, like we used to have when we were kids, like trade him, got him, and say, look, he's done this, he's done that. This is all, absolutely inarguable. Point. These are facts. Here's where you can see them. Do you still want to vote for him? And just, I had no idea that, honestly, I don't think people have any idea half the time. And that's why they'll happily cast a ballot for a monster rather than, doing their homework.
Yeah, but that's, like I said, I mean, that's where activism comes into it. That's where organized, there's I think Open Media and a coalition of groups out in BC have put together a strategy about targeting a dozen or so ridings, where just flooding, it's close ridings where the Conservatives won by a fairly small number of votes last election, and just really doing a lot of work in those ridings to bring out the message of what the Conservatives have actually done. Because you're right, most people who have and are planning on voting for the Conservatives simply don't know their role in hurtling humanity towards disaster on the climate front or innumerable other issues.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely the truth. I wish they would learn those things. They certainly are buried in the mainstream, but I'd like to thank you for contributing to the mainstream as you have over the years, as well as writing your books, and for coming on the show today with us here. So thanks very much, Yves.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracy Queries with Alan Park. Please offer comments or complaints by emailing conspiracyqueries@gmail.com or on Twitter @con_queries or at our website, conspiracyqueries.com. Thanks for listening.